Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're discussing the politics of famine and asking whose job it is to feed Somalia. We're talking about it with Duncan McLean of MSF, Doctors Without Border, Billy O'Cadamari, sister station Radio France International, and joining us from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Fouad Maznai of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. In part one, we saw James Andre's report. James Andre, who you can see that report again if you missed it in Reporters, the France 24 investigative news magazine. And we were looking at a situation that Duncan McLean described as really more volatile perhaps than what it was before the fighting, even though we didn't hear a lot of gunfire in that report. Billy O'Cadamari, I want to ask you, when you looked at that report and you think that this has been going on for 2 decades now.
It's been going on for 2 decades. What strikes me is the continued structural breakdown, even with the aid agencies in place in the capital, Mogadishu, where there's some semblance of normality, if you can call it that. There's still a problem of coordination. You can see they are not able to put their acts together with all these kind of refugees coming in, so malnourished, and some of those are spine-chilling images of children and people who had to be fed in one feeding center instead of being given food to go and cook. So you find there is still that structural problem. But the other thing which has to be noted is also that famine to the magnitude that we have seen in Somalia this year has always caused, it's not the first time in the region, but whenever there is such a big famine, there is always a political backlash with it. So I don't know whether this famine is what finally broke the back of Al-Shabaab, because famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s brought about the fall of Mengistu. The one in Somalia this time around perhaps persuaded Al-Shabaab to get out of Mogadishu. Some of their fighters are moved into famine-afflicted zones. They probably will escape and come back to where there is food distribution by the aid agencies, and maybe that will weaken Al-Shabaab. Still, we don't know. We have to wait for a few more weeks, a few months to see if there's a resurrection of Al-Shabaab as we know it from the months before, the weeks before they controlled most of Mogadishu.
All right, a lot of points in that. The complication of trying to coordinate feeding the people of Mogadishu between the various neighborhoods, the various aid agencies, and also are the Al-Shabaab militias on the ropes over this?
Yeah, no, I try to hold back on the military analysis. It's a bit beyond my expertise, but one point you did bring out. Mogadishu. It's very clear there was a retreat of sorts, what they call their tactical retreat, but they still control the vast part of the country, south central Somalia today, where we assume as well are the hardest hit parts of the famine. Of the drought. Preferably, we try not to get too much into the debate about what qualifies as a famine or not. At least within MSF. And we see very well the very obvious human consequences of that, people fleeing across the borders into Ethiopia, into Kenya, into the refugee camps. We see it very well in the capital, as we saw in the report now. But what we don't see very well is what's happening to the vast majority of the Somali population.
I was going to say, the vast majority who don't have access to those feed zones.
Exactly. We can also talk about the dynamics of the population movements as well. I just mentioned the examples of the border areas in the capital. We know very well that there are displaced camps set up within Al-Shabaab areas as well.
And you know something about it because your organization has worked in those zones.
Yeah, absolutely. We have very difficult access or non-existent access
just
for international staff to Al-Shabaab areas, but we do have MSF Somali staff working in those areas.
Because let's remind our viewers here, the Al-Shabaab militias didn't want any Western aid agencies for a long time. So how does it work? When you're dealing with those militias, what do you talk about? What do you negotiate over? What are the conditions under which they let you in?
Yeah. Well, firstly, there are some Western aid agencies that have been able to continue working in Al-Shabaab areas well before the current crisis took hold, and Médecins Sans Frontières was one of a few other agencies that were able to continue their work with Somali staff. So this is, this has happened for several years. What we do now, and it's been more or less the topic of our negotiations, I suppose, with them since certainly increased in recent months, is to be able to do independent assessments of those affected areas. So based basically on what we would evaluate as the pure medical needs. It's also to request permanently to have international staff participate in those assessments. It's to have access for therapeutic foods, for medicines. It's to make sure we have neutral structures in which we can work that are respected, meaning that they are seen as outside of the conflict.
And are they a well-organized group? When you have these, when they say, okay, you can come in, does the word get down to the foot soldiers and you're able to work?
Yes, I probably won't go into too many details of the negotiations. I'll be extremely sensitive. But it's very clearly an organized, hierarchical organization with whom there are interlocutors. I mean, when they make their press conferences and their press statements, obviously very, very difficult to engage in. But certainly from MSF's perspective, it's absolutely essential to have contact with every party in a conflict. It's what we would do anywhere else in the world. Otherwise, it's absolutely impossible to work safely. And we've taken exactly the same approach in Somalia that we would elsewhere.
Fouad Maznai, what's your reaction there, listening to Duncan McLean, and what are your contacts with those areas that are under Al-Shabaab's command?
Well, as you know, the OIC being an Islamic State's organization, and because of its cultural dimension, it has been, since March, been accepted by all parties, the governments and the armed forces on the ground. So this cultural dimension is really an asset that OIC is bringing to the international aid workers. I might cite an example that OIC, WFP approached OIC because of the lack of access in the central and southern part of Somalia, where the Al-Shabaab are holding it. They approached OIC for distributing food in Afgoy corridor. And we really signed an MOU with WFP to cater for 366,000 IDPs in Afgoy corridor. And really, that's a good example to the international community that OIC can be a good asset, a bridge to distribute food where the international aid workers cannot do it. So OIC here can really be a complementary agent because of this cultural dimension. And we have established already a coalition of 20 NGOs on the ground working all over Somalia. So it is really a good umbrella, and we are working in the Al-Shabaab area as well. And we are distributing food for over 100,000 IDPs, including the central part. And this is a good umbrella that we would like to share our assets to all aid workers.
Fouad Maznai, are you confronted with the same problems? That is to say, it's very murky knowing who is actually in charge of what when you're anywhere really inside Somalia.
Oh, yes. As I said, it's a really challenging environment that we are working on. Always the risks are there. But we have to take that risk as aid workers to save lives. We have, as I said, 20 NGOs, about 10 from international community and 10 from local community, including Muslim Aid and Islamic Relief from UK, are working under the OIC coalition on the ground. Geographically, we are assigning them we have partitioned all these on a geographical distribution. So we have any problem faced by our coalition so far. We have been there for the last almost now 5 months. We have effectively
things are moving along smoothly there.
Oh yes, we have received recently 4,000 tons from the Kuwaiti government.
Yeah. I
And
want to ask,
distributed
I'm sorry, Fouad Mouazna, I just want to put a question here to Billy Kadamari, where things not moving smoothly when you look at overall, at the bigger picture. And we see that there are two more areas, as we said at the outset, that could be declared famine zones in southern Somalia now. And we're getting a lot of criticism, and criticism that's been growing, interestingly enough, throughout the continent, saying Africans are not doing enough themselves. Hence the fact that there is this summit that's been taking place in Addis Ababa this Thursday. Only 4 heads of state and government showing up for that donor conference. The presidents of Somalia, Djibouti, and Equatorial Guinea making the trip. Still, the African Union Special Envoy to Somalia, former Ghanaian President Jerry Rawlings, putting positive spin on it all.
Your presence here today, once again, is therefore not just an opportunity to make pledges, however modest, to the famine afflicting the Horn of Africa, but to send a convincing message to the rest of the world that we are not incapable of supporting our own when the need arises.
Is the AU getting a bad rap over this, or is it right to criticize them?
I think it's getting a bad rap, but I think it's an unfair rap because the AU thinks, in the first place, it has already done something. It was on the ground when this all broke up, this all came about when the issue of famine started gaining international coverage. If it wasn't for the AU having its force on the ground, perhaps Al-Shabaab wouldn't have left Mogadishu and nobody would be flying in food and...
You're referring to the peacekeepers.
To the peacekeepers. So the AU say, well, they went in there, they at least established the environment in which the international community should then, because this was a bigger problem than they could handle. They could be accused for acting late. But of course, the AU's attention has been taken by so many things, Libya, and some of, the bigger countries on the continent who should be seen to be contributing heavily into the Somali Rescue Fund have not been doing so. They are oil-rich countries like Nigeria, Angola, and all that. And even at this pledging conference in Addis Ababa, it's actually the African Development Bank which gave the bulk of the money which was given out today, which was pledged today. The African Development Bank is not only owned by Africa, it's owned by a couple of other international bodies and countries.
States, yeah.
Exactly. So the AU has been quite slow in reacting, but perhaps better late than never.
Perhaps better late than never. The UN also going in for criticism, saying they should have raised the alarm sooner. What do you think of that?
I think I alluded to that just a little bit earlier in the discussion when we talk about raising the alarm, speaking about famine. First, for MSF, anyways, we're very cautious about throwing around that word and relating it to
you don't want to cry wolf.
Fundraising. It's not just about that. I think it's important not to simplify the situation in Somalia. I mean, obviously, extremely complex as we've been seeing in the reports and the discussion so far. And to give the impression that a famine is some sort of natural disaster epidemic that's spreading across the Horn of Africa, I think actually masks a lot of the other issues, other factors at play, notably the conflict, large among them. And then when we refer to funding itself, obviously the large feeding nutrition programs, they're expensive. They do require funding. It's quite normal in that situation that you would see these appeals, but it's also important to remember it's not simply a question of dropping money and food into Mogadishu or anywhere else in the country. Certainly, one of our main concerns, if not major concern, is not so much getting the supplies there, but getting them to the people that need them most. And that's certainly been when we speak about negotiating, been a priority for MSF, and it's certainly what makes working in Somalia extremely difficult today, and even ensuring that those people that really need the help are actually getting it.
Absolutely.
All right, and it's we're saying how perhaps it's an oversimplification to blame the AU for being slow off the mark. David Adams, writing in the Irish Times this Thursday, warns it may be oversimplification blaming al-Shabaab for everything. They say he says they're partially to blame for the severity of the famine and the resulting deaths and misery, however, not completely, although it suits a lot of interest to pretend that it is. What passes for a government in Somalia has not been alone in stating that support for al-Shabaab will evaporate because of the famine. Instead of intervening militarily in yet another Muslim country, the major powers will concentrate only on helping those who can make it to refugee camps and on the fringes of the famine, ignoring the 80% who are not receiving aid, and let al-Shabaab carry the can for the eventual death toll. Billy Kadamari, are we too quick, perhaps, to make al-Shabaab the bogeyman
Well, I think it's not too quick. They're actually the bogeyman here. If you look at the whole configuration of Somalia, why is it that the famine is not so severe in Puntland, where aid agencies have had access for some time in the semi-autonomous region of Puntland, in the internationally unrecognized Republic of Somaliland? It's not severe there. It's because the systems there were working. There was access. In the other part of Somalia where famine has been declared, there was no access largely by the aid agencies because al-Shabaab was in control there. If they were not, some of these people would have been reached long ago by the aid agencies. Then the early warning systems would have shown that there is an emergency emerging, coming out in these places, and the world needs to act. Of course, the world would have gone there earlier enough before these thousands of Somalis died. So I think al-Shabaab partly carries the blame. And probably if you look at one of the ladies in James Andrews' report there, was saying that al-Shabaab could even grab their cattle, the remaining animals that they had, which they were moving with, and so they had to make their way to a place where they can be fed. So in essence, al-Shabaab is part of the problem. Even the little that people have in the countryside, they are grabbing from them, and sometimes they're not allowing other people to reach the feeding centers.
All right, one final point. You mentioned Puntland. We can perhaps look at a map. There are two breakaway regions in Somalia. There's also Somaliland that you see there next to Puntland. Going forward, is sort of, I guess, devolution or a breakup of Somalia perhaps the way to end what really, again, 2 decades of this chronic chaos?
I mean, even if it is broken up, it's almost practically broken up for now, but it hasn't brought the peace that everybody yearned for. Somaliland, on the other hand, doesn't want anything to do with the rest of Somalia. They have been quite a peaceful place. They have had their elections, but nobody recognizes them. Puntland is a bit peaceful, but I don't know whether that's the model that the new Somalia should become.
So there's no quick fix solution.
There's no quick fix solution. Perhaps this crisis presents a good opportunity for the international community to look into the mirror and see what they can really or could have done for Somalia thus far.
All right, and there's still a lot to be done in terms of the immediate emergency. I want to thank for joining us Duncan McLean of Doctors Without Borders, MSF. I want to thank Fouad Maznai of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation for joining us from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and you, Billy O'Kadamari. Thank you for being with us for the France 24 debate. Stay with us. It's Business Next with Marcus Carlson.